Welcome to the ArtMiabo Podcast, the show where we talk to fine artists, creative minds, and cultural backers from the African continent and beyond. I'm your host, Gifton Yadike, and if you enjoy these kinds of conversations, please be sure to leave a like and a comment, and of course, subscribe to the channel. My guest today is a Nigerian filmmaker and documentarian whose directorial debut, Mi Tazi, takes audiences on a deeply personal journey into the ancient legacy of the Nok, using the media of film to not only explore how cultures preserve themselves, but individual memories, how those can be preserved as well. She is also one of the participating artists at the 5th annual ArtMiabo International Art Festival. Miss Blessing Bulus, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing well. How are you?
I am great. Thank you very much. So I know I set the table a bit for the audience, but could you please, in a bit more detail, introduce yourself for those who may be unfamiliar with you?
As you rightly mentioned earlier, my name is Blessing Bulus. I am a visual storyteller and a filmmaker. Over the years, I have worked in different parts of the creative industry, specifically film, TV, and photography. I have worked on production in different capacity, and I have been involved pretty much in photography and in visual art. So I would say that storytelling has always been at the center of what I do, even when, sometimes the medium changes depending on the stories I'm telling part time. And through it all, I would say that I have just continued to follow the things that, interest me, and things like stories of people, stories of places, stories that are rooted in identity. And, I would say all of that experience have really led me to where I am today. And like you rightly mentioned, Mi Tazi is my directorial debut, but beyond it being my first film as a documentary filmmaker, it comes after, so many years of, learning, working within the industry and just being part of this industry at large in different ways.
Thank you so much for that. While we ease into the next question, take us through some of those years. Tell us a bit more about your journey as a visual storyteller, but also as a filmmaker. What was it that put you here on this path?
Hearing your question now, I am thinking, where do I even start from? But I mean, I think I
The
know
beginning.
where I should. Yeah, right. I think I should start from the beginning. And I would say that my journey into filmmaking really began with curiosity as a young child and, my love for storytelling. I remember growing up as a child, I would watch Nollywood films, and I would just be curious to, how are these people making this film? How are the actors changing from one costume to the other? Like, it was just so much of a wonder to me. And, I think it got even heightened when, my dad was a big lover of music, and, he would buy music videos, and whenever we watch music videos, I'm always amazed by it. And specifically with the music of Brenda Fossey, I remember watching It's Your Wedding Day, and because she had children in the music video, I was like, oh my god, I have to be one of those kids. I wanted to be one of those kids so bad. And years down the line, I studied mass communication for my first degree. And over time, I found myself, while in school, being drawn to visual storytelling, and, then eventually also got interested in documentary as a whole, be it through pictures or through a motion picture. And shortly before I graduated from school, I got a scholarship to go to a film school that was organized by the Multi-Choice Talent Factory. And while in film school, I got introduced to producing, I got introduced to different forms of, filmmaking in that sense. And I would say that graduating from that school, I have worked in like different areas of film over the years, but Mi Tazi became a very important point in my journey because it was really the first time that I am telling a story from my point of view. And what even makes it truly special is the fact that it was also the first time that not only was I telling a story from my point of view, but telling a story that was so personal to me. And, directing this really taught me that sometimes the stories closest to us can also carry, something that is way bigger than us. And I would say that my journey has increasingly been about recognizing my voice as a storyteller and, telling stories that feel relatable to me, not necessarily whether or not I'm connected to that story per se, but, in just seeing a story that resonates with me and, just finding ways to tell the right story, from start to finish.
Thank you so much for that. You just spoke about the personal nature of Mi Tazi as a film, and as has
Yeah.
been documented in other forms of media, this was at its core a very personal story about you remembering your late father.
Yeah.
But
Mm-hmm.
rather than telling that story in isolation, you weave it together with the history of the Nok civilization. What is it that brought those two journeys together?
So the journey of Mi Tazi really, it's not, I would say it's not, I didn't wake up one morning and say, oh, I'm going to make a film about, Nok or about my father. Honestly, I didn't set out, just to make a film about my father and the Nok civilization. That wasn't the plan. However, when my father died, I was about 14, 15. So I was pretty young at the time. And this year marks exactly 15 years since he had died. And I don't have a photograph with my father. And I realized that the memories that I have of him and with him are beginning to fade, right? And it's like my father, when he was alive, was such a present father, very loving, but there's really no physical proof, so to say, to show of these beautiful memories that I have had with my father. And so in a way to connect with him, I went back home to Knock, and as a way to connect with not just him, but also my family and to the place that I come from. And why this became an urgent need for me to return home was simply because, I was doing a program in University of Lagos, Unilag, where, I was in a history class and my lecturer, Dr. Onipede, called me out because he knows where I am from, calls me out and says that I should, talk about my people from North. And in that instant, I was pretty much, you know, stunned that he would call me out in that moment to call, because prior to that time, I would say that the first time that I heard about knock was in secondary school when I did fine art, and then, my teacher then was talking about types of terracottas, and then he mentioned knock. But as at then, I probably maybe 12, so it didn't really mean anything to me hearing about knock. In fact, I grew up not connecting the knock of my village to the knock that I read from books. So when my lecturer called me out that day in uni, like, it was like, I come from such a rich history. How come I didn't hear about it? Or whenever we go to the village, I don't really hear much about it. And then it was also that, and then the fact that I wanted to really see the place for myself. And especially because, a lot of times we think that heritage is usually the artifact you see in the museum or the object, but far more than that. History sometimes cannot tell us how a place feels. So it was me saying that I want to feel my father again. I want to feel the place. So it was me, deciding to go back home. And in going back home and in being there, I started to think about, or to even see memory in a very bigger way, because here I was in Nok that has such an important story, and yet not so much of that, is not so much of that history is about. Here I was in Nok, right, trying to make sense of my father, the history that I am just being aware of. So trying to put all of this and to make sense of it, because really my ancestors are no longer here to, tell me their stories, but their art is there, their remains through, be it the artifact, be it the material. In fact, we can all agree that there is a trace of their existence that is still remaining in Nok. Even as I was engaging with some of my uncles, they were telling me stories of the past. And so in a way to connect with my father, I went back home to Nok to, connect with him, to connect with my family, and to connect to where I am from. Because I would say that now, in the moment that I realized that I didn't know much about it, it was like, oh, I have to go there and, to find things for myself. And just being there in Nok, and, as each day went by, it then made me to start to think of history and memory in a bigger way, because here I was in Nok with such an important history, and yet so much of that history is also something that I was there trying to piece together what is being remained. Because part of what I realized while I was in the village was that my paternal great grandmother used to be an artist who, molded clay pots. And I saw one of the pots. In fact, over the years where we would go to the village, I never knew that that pot was being created by my paternal great grandmother. So just being in that place is more or less me trying to piece all of these histories of over hundreds of years ago. And really, the fact that my ancestors are no longer here to tell the stories of, their time, I could still see, their remains. I could still see their artwork. Using my great grandmother's pot as an example, it sort of shows that these people existed, long time ago before I was here. And it also made me to, think of my father in that same way, because my father is gone, but there are some of his things that are left behind. I mean, it's been 15 years now, but we still have some of my father's clothes. We still have his memories, however, you know, faded those memories can be. But I mean, there's still a large chunk of that memory that I am still holding on to. There are still stories. If I just going back home, I learned some new informations about my father that I didn't know prior to going back home. And I would even say that me as a living person is also a remain. I would say is also my father's legacy that is still living and breathing. So I would say that
That's a wonderful
Mitazi,
perspective, by the way.
pardon?
I was saying that's a wonderful perspective. You being
Okay.
his legacy by just being
Yeah.
alive. It's a wonderful perspective.
Thank you. So I would say that Mitazi became a film about memory, both on a personal level and both as a collective level. When you think about knock history and knock culture as a whole.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Interestingly, when we began this particular iteration of the ArtMiabo podcast,
Mm-hmm.
our first guest was Mr. Yahaya Makari,
Mm-hmm.
whose documentary, Weha, it also
Mm-hmm.
explored the Nakh civilization. And obviously, as established with your film, it was a personal one because you were trying to connect back with your father through your ancestors.
Yeah.
I am
Mm-hmm.
curious, though, if the broader conversation around the Nakh civilization that he helped facilitate, and to this day, he's still continuing to facilitate, if it had any influence on your own work at all, or if it just was just purely your own independent journey.
I personally don't know Yahaya. In fact, someone saw my film and mentioned that he also has a film on Knock. But I mean, I'm yet to see his film. I would say that my journey with Mitazi was purely independent, and like
Okay.
I mentioned earlier, it began from a very personal place of curiosity. and, from a place of also me being afraid of, forgetting my father completely. And, as a way of, responding to that, I went back home. So I would say that I wasn't responding directly to any existing work or a broader conversation around knock. However, at the time when I knew that I wanted to tell the story of knock, one of the things I also wanted to ensure that I do was that I wanted to tell it from a personal point of view, because during the art history class that brought about this conversation about knock, I went back and, researching about knock. And if you go on the internet now and search about knock, or in fact, if you go to YouTube and, you type in knock art or knock culture or knock history, a lot of what you would see is pretty much from the Western point of view. And even when you see Africans talking about it, it's usually from an academic point of view. And so I knew right then that whenever I'm going to tell the story of knock, I was going to tell it from a personal point of view. I was going to tell it in a way that my 15-year-old brother can watch it and, would sit and watch it from start to finish. So I would say that maybe in that way, I would say that was how I responded to a broader conversation around knock. But then I went back because of my own relationship with the place and my desire to reconnect with my father's memory and my ancestry. But once I began that journey and the research, I realized that knock carried such a big history that, is bigger than just my personal story. And I think that I would say that the personal story is pretty much the anchor of the documentary in itself. And
Yes, and I actually have a question relating to that, if I could.
pardon?
Sorry to cut you off there, but I actually do have a question that relates to that, because we're actually moving into
Yes.
that. But I want to zero in on the point you made. You wanted to create a documentary that your 15-year-old brother could watch, and
Mm-hmm.
I think it's fair to say, the common view of a documentary is that the facts should take precedence. You want to make sure that what you're presenting is true, but that
Mm-hmm.
storytelling aspect is inseparable. So when you
Yeah.
are telling a true story, that you want to make
Mm-hmm.
you want to make sure everyone that knows that this is true,
Mm-hmm.
especially one that is close to you. But how do you balance the historical and factual accuracy with
Mm-hmm.
the emotional truth you're trying to communicate?
That's such a good question. For me, I would say that one should not come at the expense of the other, right? The facts are important because they are what gives the story its credibility, right? And especially when you are dealing with history and real people. I'll give you a quick story. At some point, I was thinking, okay, because you and I would agree that the story and history of knock is not, you can't pack all of that information in 15 minutes documentary or in 20 minutes documentary. But I also wanted to tell it from a personal point of view. And so I knew that the two has to collide in at some point, but I just have to stay true to the story in its integrity. But facts alone don't always tell what something feels like. Remember earlier I mentioned that I wanted to go to knock to feel it for myself, far from what I learned within the four walls of school, or what I would read from book. And with Mi Tazi, I was careful about the historical element and, the information surrounding knock. But I also understood that my experience, of grief, and of memory could not be measured in the same way as the historical facts. So the emotional parts, the emotional truth of the film comes from me being honest about my lived experience, right? And if you have seen the film already, I would say that in the entire scene, nothing was acted. These are real life as it unfolds. So it was just me being honest. And even with the fear of me remembering, it was me also being honest with, okay, I remember this, okay, I don't remember this. And even with the uncertainty of memory in itself, I didn't want to pretend that I had all the answers, because sometimes the most truthful thing you can say is, I don't remember. Like, that's just the most truthful thing you can say. And for me, that honesty became a part of the storytelling. And, a lot of people have said that one of the things that they enjoyed about the film, or that they appreciated about the film, is the honesty and the vulnerability of the film.
Thank you so much for that. That was a wonderful answer. My final question relates to this year's the ArtMiabo International Art Festival for 2026.
Mm-hmm.
It's built around the theme of African art, heritage, and legacy. And your work is a natural extension of that conversation. How do you see documentary storytelling contributing to the preservation of African heritage and legacy?
I would say that documentary is a form of documentation and preservation, because so much of African history, so much of its culture and, knowledge exists in people, be it through oral history, be it through lived experiences, our language, our tradition, right? And as generation pass, from one generation to the other, some of these things can sometimes disappear if they are not being, shall I say, recorded or passed down from one generation to the other. And this is where documentary comes into play, because it gives us that opportunity to, listen, to document, and to preserve. And I would say that if someone picks up Mi Tazi in the next 5 years or in the next 10 years, they would have an experience of what had happened prior to them engaging with that documentary. So I would say that documentary is not just about major events or, historical events. It's also in recording and, documenting the everyday stories too, because sometimes heritage really exists in the smallest things, right? It's in how someone remembers a place, how maybe your grandmother tells you a story about something, or, it's in the objects. Like I mentioned earlier, my father is dead 15 years on, but we still have some of his clothes, we still have some of his books, and I would say that it's also about language that is slowly disappearing. I'll use myself as a point of example. I don't really speak my native dialect that well. And so sometimes when that thought comes to my head, I'm almost afraid that when I start having children, what language am I going to pass down to my children? So imagine if there is a documentary that, documents these languages that, people can watch over and over again and also learn. That would truly be incredible. And so for me, I would say that Mitazi is an example of, that documentation. It began with, my attempt of remembering my father. It's also what, thinking about Knock in its entirety is also about what we remember as a people, and what we risk, if we don't preserve this story. Imagine me going back to Knock and nobody remembers the stories that their fathers or grandfathers or, great grandfathers had told them before then. But again, I would say that's the power of documentaries. It's also a form of documentation and preservation. And also, I believe that heritage is not just, something that we inherit. It's also something that we are responsible for. And I liken this with that desire that, okay, aside from me just telling the story of Nog, I also want something, like I felt responsible to my brother, because I was like, I want him to watch the film and also learn about, our culture and where we come from. So I would say that heritage is also about something that, we have a responsibility to remember and sometimes to question, because when we have answers to these questions, then we can, pass it on from one generation to the other. Because I remember that when my brother saw the film, he also wanted to go back. There are some questions that he also had, and what is this? How does this place look like? Oh, I would love to go there. And, so I would say that that's another way of, passing on the heritage. Heritage is not just, what is in the museum, but it's also, in the ways that we tell stories and how we pass it on from one generation to the other.
Ms. Blessing Bulus, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for your time. This was a lovely conversation. Maybe we want to end up, maybe you can let our audience know where and how they can watch your film if it's still out there in circulation.
Mi Tazi is currently on festival circles, but after that, we are looking at ways to have it available on streaming platforms, so every other person can get to experience Mi Tazi.
Forward to that then. Thank you once again for joining us. Thank you, our viewers, for joining us for another episode of the ArtMiabo Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a like, share, subscribe, and of course, comment. This is ArtMiabo. I am Gift Inyadike.